Sometimes one date is all it takes to change everything. And that's exactly what happened to me. I'm 65 years old, and after years of living a quiet, independent life, I decided it was time to dip my toes back into the dating pool. I've had my fair share of ups and downs, but after some encouragement from friends, I figured, why not? Life is meant to be lived, right? So, when a close friend suggested I try a blind date, I hesitated at first but eventually agreed. It wasn't just any date. It was an experience I hoped would bring excitement, maybe even companionship. What I didn't know was that this meeting would unfold in a way I never could have predicted. It all started with my well-meaning friend, Carol. She's the kind of person who always has someone in mind for you, someone who she swears will change your life if you just give them a chance. For years, Carol had been trying to set me up, but I always politely declined. I wasn't against dating. I just valued my independence and didn't feel the need to fill my life with anything unless it really felt right. But Carol was persistent. One afternoon, after a long coffee chat where she managed to weave her matchmaking attempts into every topic, I finally relented. "Okay, Carol," I said, throwing up my hands in mock surrender. "One date, but if this doesn't go well, I'm retiring from blind dating for good." She laughed, clearly thrilled with herself. "She's lovely," Carol said. "Independent, intelligent, and just the right balance of adventurous and grounded. You're going to hit it off." I wasn't convinced, but I had to admit, part of me was curious. After all, I was 65 and hadn't been on a blind date, well, ever. Life has its rhythms, and when you've been single for a while, it's easy to get comfortable in your own world. But Carol's words stuck with me. Life's too short to say no to new experiences. I remember that evening vividly. I walked into the restaurant feeling a mixture of nerves and curiosity. There's something uniquely strange about walking into a place, not knowing who you're about to meet but hoping for the best. I scanned the room, and there she was, seated at a cozy corner table near the window, wearing a warm smile that made me relax a little. She looked composed, elegant, and confident. As I approached, she greeted me with a friendly wave, and I thought, this might just be a lovely evening. I introduced myself, and we exchanged pleasantries. The conversation flowed easily at first. Little things about where we grew up, what we did for work. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, comments about the weather, a quick note about how nice the restaurant was. I learned that she was 52, had recently made some life changes, and was settling into a slower, more deliberate phase of life. As we talked, I started to relax. The initial nerves melted away as we ordered drinks. So, let me ask you, how would you react if someone sat across from you on a first date and laid out their demands like a contract? By the end of this story, you'll know exactly what happened and why I had no choice but to walk away. The server came by to take our drink orders. She asked for a glass of Pinot Noir, and I opted for a simple whiskey on the rocks. For a few moments, everything felt perfectly normal. Then, she leaned in slightly, folded her hands neatly on the table, and tilted her head just so. "David," she began, "I think it's important to set a few things straight right from the beginning." I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in tone. There wasn't a hint of nervousness in her voice, only calm certainty. I let out a soft laugh, thinking maybe she was setting up for a joke. "Oh?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She didn't smile back. Instead, she nodded and continued. "I have a few expectations when it comes to dating. I believe it's better to be upfront so there are no misunderstandings later." I paused for a moment, processing what she'd just said. This wasn't a flirty comment about preferences or a cute anecdote to break the ice. She sounded like she was opening a meeting with an agenda. My internal monologue kicked into gear. Expectations? On a first date? This was definitely a new one for me. But I stayed calm, curious to see where this was headed. "Okay," I said cautiously, offering a polite smile. I suppose there's nothing wrong with knowing what you want. She smiled back, a faint, measured smile. Exactly. In that moment, the air shifted. The easy, casual tone from earlier had been replaced by something more structured, more serious. I wasn't sure whether to admire her directness or to brace myself for what was coming. And then came the first curveball. She cleared her throat gently, as if easing into what she was about to say. First, I want to make sure that whoever I date doesn't travel too frequently. I value stability and consistency. I need to know that the person I'm seeing is going to be present, not off to some faraway place for weeks at a time. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my expression neutral. Travel restrictions? It wasn't the strangest thing I'd heard, but something about the way she framed it caught my attention. This wasn't framed as a casual preference. It sounded more like a line item in a pre-written agreement. I took a sip of my drink to buy myself a moment. That makes sense, I said carefully, not sure how else to respond. We all have things that are important to us. She smiled again, but there was a sharpness to it, like she was pleased that I was agreeing so far. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into something entirely different from what I'd expected. And as it turned out, that was only the beginning. So, she said, tilting her head slightly, what do you usually do with your mornings? I smiled and shrugged. Well, I'm an early riser. I like to read the news with my coffee, maybe go for a walk if the weather's nice. Nothing too fancy. She nodded, making mental notes as though my answer was part of some larger evaluation. What about weekends? She asked next. Mostly time with friends, the occasional trip to the lake house. I paused, curious. Why do you ask? She laughed softly and waved a hand. Oh, I just like to get a sense of people's routines. You can tell a lot about someone by how they spend their free time. It seemed innocent enough, but it felt like there was more behind her questions. Still, I brushed it off. Maybe she was just someone who liked to really understand people she was getting to know. Nothing wrong with that, right? Part of me admired her directness. After all, isn't that what we're told to do in life? Be clear about your expectations, know your boundaries, and communicate openly. But this wasn't a conversation about a long-term relationship after months of dating. This was a blind date, a first meeting over drinks and small talk. Still, I decided to play along and keep an open mind. Okay, I said slowly, leaning back slightly. She smiled, a faint, almost approving smile, like I'd passed some unspoken test. Exactly. The air between us shifted. What had started as a light, exploratory conversation was now something much more serious. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel my instincts telling me to stay alert. But it wasn't just what she was asking. It was how she was asking. This didn't feel like a casual preference or a cute quirk. It felt like the opening terms of an agreement. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the sense that this date was heading into unfamiliar territory. And I was right. Her first request seemed straightforward enough. She wanted to make sure that I wasn't someone who traveled frequently. She explained that stability was incredibly important to her, and she didn't want a partner who'd be jetting off every few weeks or prioritizing spontaneous trips over quality time at home. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. After all, plenty of people value consistency and want a partner who's present. But there was something about the way she framed it that caught me off guard. It wasn't a casual comment, like, I love a quiet life and someone who's around. No, it was more like a formalized statement, a non-negotiable. Her tone was polite but resolute, as though she'd spent a lot of time refining exactly how to present this requirement. She gave me a small, approving smile, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel at ease. It felt more like I'd checked a box. Still, I didn't want to overreact. Everyone has things they care about, things that shape what they want in a relationship. And honestly, I wasn't the type to be constantly on the go. I'd done my share of traveling when I was younger, but now, I was more than content with quiet weekends at home or simple getaways close to town. But just as I was reassuring myself that this was nothing out of the ordinary, she continued. "There's more," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I also believe in having regular check-ins in a relationship, open communication, where both people can be completely transparent about how things are going. In fact, I prefer to schedule those conversations weekly." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "You mean, like a meeting?" I asked, half laughing to soften the question. "Yes," she replied without a hint of hesitation. "Exactly like a meeting. I think it's important to treat a relationship with the same level of care and attention as you would to a business partnership. You wouldn't run a company without regular reviews, would you?" I took a sip of my drink, giving myself a moment to think. I wasn't opposed to open communication, far from it, but weekly meetings felt excessive. Relationships are built on natural conversations, the kind that happen spontaneously while you're having coffee or going for a walk. The idea of scheduling those talks like clockwork felt a little mechanical, as though intimacy was being replaced by structure. Still, I didn't want to judge too quickly. I reminded myself that everyone approaches relationships differently, and maybe this was her way of ensuring things stayed healthy and grounded. "That's an interesting way to look at it," I said carefully. "I can see how that might work for some people." She nodded again, looking pleased with my response, but I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. I wasn't sure if I agreed with her approach, but I didn't want to come across as dismissive either. I told myself it was just one perspective, one small quirk, and that it didn't necessarily mean the date was heading off a cliff. But then, she leaned in again, her eyes steady and calm. "There's one more thing," she said. I felt myself brace instinctively. "I believe in setting clear expectations around finances early on," she continued. "No surprises, no hidden expenses. I expect complete transparency. Bank statements, monthly budgets, that sort of thing." My heart skipped a beat. Did she just say bank statements? For the first time that evening, I wasn't sure if I could keep my expression neutral. "Wait, you mean you expect that in a future relationship?" I asked, trying to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. "Yes," she said with a nod, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I believe financial transparency is key to avoiding unnecessary conflict. I like to know where things stand." I felt like I'd stepped into a conversation meant for a couple married for 10 years, not two people who had just met over drinks. My mind was racing as I tried to keep calm. This wasn't just about preferences anymore. It felt like she was presenting me with a checklist that needed approval before we could even get through dinner. I nodded politely, though my thoughts were anything but calm. How many more of these expectations are coming? I wondered. As the conversation continued, I began to realize that this wasn't just a conversation about compatibility. It was a negotiation, and I wasn't sure I wanted to sign the contract. Her third demand caught me completely off guard. After laying out her expectations for stability and financial transparency, she smiled, took another sip of her wine, and leaned in as though she was about to share a groundbreaking idea. "There's something else that I believe is essential for a healthy relationship," she said, her tone calm but unwavering. She took another sip of her wine, paused for a moment as if choosing her next words carefully, and then smiled. "There's something else that's very important to me," she said. At this point, I was barely surprised that there was more. "Go on," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I believe in privacy and boundaries," she began. "And one way I ensure that is by setting strict guidelines for social media." I nodded slowly, unsure of what she meant. "You mean keeping things private? Like not sharing too much online?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not quite. What I mean is that I prefer to have control over what gets posted about our relationship, or even about our time together. I don't want to be caught off guard by something on Facebook or Instagram that I haven't approved. I blinked. Approved. So, you'd want me to run any post or picture by you before I share it? I asked, trying to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. Exactly, she said with a calm nod. I think it's important to be aligned on what parts of our lives we share with the world. Some things should remain private, and I like to be on the same page before anything goes public. I leaned back slightly, digesting her words. I understood the importance of privacy. I wasn't someone who lived my life online, sharing every detail of my day. But this felt controlling. The idea that I'd need to get approval for something as simple as a casual post felt restrictive. At that moment, I felt like I had been transported from a quiet dinner date to a boardroom meeting where someone was presenting terms and conditions for a partnership. I half expected her to slide a contract across the table for me to sign. I couldn't help but feel like I was being vetted for a job instead of being asked to share a connection. The structure, the rigidity, it stripped away any sense of spontaneity or joy. I wasn't against structure in life, but love, in my opinion, wasn't supposed to feel like an agenda item or a weekly performance review. I took a slow breath, trying to keep my composure. She was sitting there, calm and confident, as though everything she just outlined was perfectly reasonable. And maybe in her world, it was. But in mine, it felt suffocating. At that point, I wasn't even thinking about how to make the date work anymore. I was thinking about how to make a graceful exit. I respected that she knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to express it. But this wasn't the kind of connection I was looking for. This wasn't about building something meaningful together. It was about whether I could fit into her pre-planned structure. And I knew, without question, that I couldn't. As I sat there, watching her take another sip of wine, I wondered how this date would end. I wasn't sure what I was more shocked by, the demands themselves or the fact that she seemed completely unaware of how overwhelming they were. I took a deep breath and looked around the room, as if hoping to find something, a way to steer the conversation in a different direction, a lifeline to pull this date back to something normal. But there wasn't one. I turned back to her and met her gaze. She was sitting there, calm and expectant, as if waiting for me to either agree to her terms or ask thoughtful follow-up questions. I felt a strange mix of emotions and disbelief, but oddly enough, not anger. She wasn't trying to be difficult or rude. She genuinely believed in everything she was saying. She thought she was being clear and proactive. With a calm voice, I said, "I think we're looking for very different things." She tilted her head slightly, as if processing my words. "Different how?" she asked, her voice still steady. I smiled, not out of amusement, but because I knew this was the kindest way to end things. "You know exactly what you want, and I respect that," I replied. "But I don't think I'm the right fit for this." Her expression didn't change much, just a small, almost imperceptible frown. I could tell she was trying to understand, but didn't quite get it. I stood up slowly, took out my wallet, and placed enough cash on the table to cover my drink. "Thank you for your time," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." With that, I turned and walked toward the exit. No drama, no raised voices, just quiet resolve. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I took a deep breath. The street was calm. I shoved my hands into my pockets and started walking, feeling the fresh air wash over me. I wasn't angry, just surprised. Who brings a list of demands to a blind date? Blind dates are supposed to be unpredictable, awkward, maybe even funny. You're meant to get to know someone, to share a few laughs, to figure out if there's enough common ground to warrant a second date. But this felt like an entirely different experience, like a performance review rather than an introduction. The more I thought about it, the more anxious it felt. I wasn't upset at her. In some ways, I admired her self-awareness and her confidence in laying it all out there. but it was clear that she was looking for someone who could slot neatly into the life she had meticulously planned. And I wasn't that person. I never wanted to be a puzzle piece in someone else's life. I wanted to build something together, with all the spontaneity, messiness, and joy that came with it. I walked for a while. By the time I reached the quiet corner where I'd parked my car, I felt a sense of peace. I'd made the right decision. Sometimes, walking away isn't about giving up. It's about knowing when something just doesn't fit. As I unlocked the door and climbed in, I found myself chuckling softly. Maybe I should have asked for a copy of her demands in writing. The thought made me laugh, easing the tension that had built up over the evening. As I drove home, I realized something important. That night wasn't a failure. It was a reminder that dating isn't about ticking boxes or meeting expectations. It's about connection, about finding someone whose quirks complement your own, not someone who hands you a script to follow. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see Jenna again, but I hoped she'd find someone who was on her wavelength. As for me, I'd stick to the unpredictable, messy magic of meeting people who weren't perfect, but were real. That blind date didn't turn out the way I'd hoped, but it made one thing clear. I wasn't looking for perfection. I was looking for something human, and that was worth waiting for. In life, we're often told that we need to be patient, to give people a chance, to compromise for the sake of love or connection. And in most cases, that's true. But there's a difference between compromising on little things, like which movie to watch or where to eat, and compromising on the core of who you are and how you live your life. So, let me ask you, would you have stayed to see how things played out? Or would you have walked away, too? I'm curious to know how you'd handle a situation like this. Dating at any age comes with its challenges, its awkward moments, and its lessons. Whether you're 25 or 65, everyone has a story of a date that went sideways. Some of those stories become funny anecdotes you tell your friends. Others leave you reflecting on what you want and don't want in a partner. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I can't wait to read them. Who knows? Maybe we've all had a date that taught us something valuable. And maybe, just maybe, sharing those stories will remind us all that we're not alone in the wild, unpredictable world of dating.